The courtroom was buzzing with the soft shuffle of feet and papers being arranged as people settled into their seats. All eyes turned toward the front, where Judge Thomas Whittaker prepared to begin his day. The air was thick with anticipation as the defendant's case was about to be heard. Angela Harper, a woman in her early 40s, stood in the back of the room nervously clutching her worn leather purse. The cold echo of her heels on the polished floor seemed louder than it should have as she made her way toward the center of the room. Her heart raced with each step, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she adjusted her posture to stand tall. She had to make a good impression today. It had been months of hard work and stress, and now she was here facing charges that could change everything for her. Her eyes avoided the judge's gaze. As she glanced briefly at the people seated around the courtroom, the faces were unfamiliar, but the coldness in their stares was all too familiar. This was not the first time she had stood in front of a judge, but today felt different. Today was worse. Angela had always been the type to keep to herself. She had learned long ago that people didn't care about her struggles. They never asked why she was late or why she was tired. They only cared about results. And today she had none to show for herself. As a single mother of an adult son, Marcus, she had spent years working long hours as a cashier trying to provide the best life she could for him, but the struggles never seemed to end. She had been late on bills, missed rent payments, and now this driving without a valid license. Angela never intended for it to happen, but life had a way of piling on when you weren't looking. Her car had broken down a few months ago, and without the funds to fix it, she had to rely on public transportation, but even that was unreliable at times. There had been a notice from the DMV months ago about her expiring license. Up between work and taking care of Marcus's college needs, it had slipped through the cracks. Now here she was. The judge's voice broke through her thoughts as he called her name. Angela Harper. She stepped forward, her legs feeling as though they might buckle beneath her, but she steadied herself. The sharpness in the judge's voice didn't help calm her nerves. Judge Whittaker was known for his stern demeanor, and even from the moment he stepped into the room, Angela could sense that he was a man who valued order and discipline. The way he moved in and out of cases without showing emotion made it clear that he had seen it all and was not one to be swayed by personal stories or pleas for mercy. She took a deep breath and stood straighter when the judge looked up at her for the first time. His eyes were cold and calculating. His gaze flicked over the documents in front of him as he scanned the charges laid out against her. Angela could see his mind working, but it felt like he was seeing only the facts and not the person behind them. She waited silently for him to speak again, the weight of his gaze now feeling like a pressure she could not escape. Angela stood there as the judge continued to read over her case file, and her mind wandered back to the past few years of her life, the constant battle to stay afloat and to provide a future for her son Marcus, who was now away at college. It seemed like just yesterday she was holding him in her arms, promising him a better life than she had growing up. She had worked long hours at minimum wage jobs, never asking for much, but always hoping that somehow things would get better. But now in this moment she couldn't help but feel that everything was slipping away. Her hopes, her dreams, and the hard work she had put in to give Marcus the opportunities she never had. Angela glanced at the floor as the judge flipped through her file as if her life were nothing more than a stack of papers. She could feel the judgment radiating from him. It wasn't just about the fine or the license anymore. It felt as though her entire existence was being weighed and found wanting. The prosecutor stood up and began speaking in a professional tone, presenting the facts of the case. She had no license and was caught driving on the road without it. They argued that she had been irresponsible and negligent in failing to renew it, and that she should be penalized accordingly. Angela's heart sank with each word. It felt as though every flaw in her life was being laid bare, and she was powerless to defend herself. Her hands tightened around her purse as she tried to steady her breathing. She wanted to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. She was afraid that if she opened her mouth, she would only make things worse. Judge Whittaker listened intently to the prosecutor's points, nodding here and there as he absorbed the details of the case before turning his attention back to Angela. She could feel the weight of his gaze bearing down on her, his eyes cold and detached, as though he were looking at nothing more than a statistic rather than a person standing in front of him. Angela's throat felt tight, but she forced herself to speak. Her voice came out quieter than she expected, but she spoke nonetheless. Your Honor, I know I've made a mistake, but I'm not a criminal. I'm a mother just trying to get by. Please, believe me, I didn't mean to let this happen. I didn't mean to break the law. I'm just trying to take care of my son and make sure he has a future. But I've been struggling and I just missed it. Her voice cracked toward the end and she felt a tear slip down her cheek. But she quickly wiped it away as the judge didn't seem to acknowledge her plea. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that seemed to say that he had already made up his mind. Angela's heart beat faster as she realized he wasn't going to show her any mercy. He wasn't interested in hearing her story or her struggles. He was only focused on the law. The fine had to be paid. The punishment had to be carried out. The details of her life were irrelevant. As she stood there waiting for the judge to pronounce his verdict, she thought of Marcus, her son, who had been so hopeful about the future. But she feared that this mistake would cost him the chance at a better life she had worked so hard for, and suddenly she wondered if all the sacrifices she had made over the years had been for nothing. Judge Whittaker's hand hovered over the gavel as he stared at the file in front of him. His eyes narrowed slightly as he calculated the penalty for Angela Harper. In his mind, his thoughts were detached and methodical, looking at the law and the consequences of breaking it, rather than considering the human being standing before him. Angela's words echoed in his ears, but they seemed distant, almost irrelevant compared to the dry facts that filled the papers before him. He didn't even notice the way her hands shook, or how her shoulders hunched in defeat. He had seen so many cases like hers over the years, people who made mistakes, people who didn't pay attention to the details of their lives, and paid the price for it. The law didn't care about the reasons behind the actions, it only cared about the actions themselves. And Angela Harper had broken the law, so the punishment was simple and clear. His mind was already made up before she finished speaking. He could see the history of her offenses and the fact that she had failed to correct her mistakes over the years. He was a judge who valued order and responsibility, and Angela's record told him that she had shown neither. In his eyes, she was just another person who had been careless with the rules and now needed to face the consequences. There was no room for empathy in his courtroom, no space for the story behind the story, no consideration of the life that had led to this moment. He simply saw a woman who had failed to renew her license and was now facing the penalty for it. The prosecutor spoke again, urging the judge to impose the maximum fine, and as the words fell into the air, Angela felt like they were hitting her like a physical blow. She had heard people talk about fines before, but never thought it would be something she would have to face. She had hoped for a warning or maybe a reduction in the penalty, but now it was clear that Judge Whittaker had no intention of showing any leniency. He was going to make an example out of her, and she could feel the weight of his decision like a stone pressing down on her chest. Her pulse quickened as she braced herself for what was coming. Judge Whittaker finally looked up from the file and met her eyes. His expression was stern and unreadable as he spoke. Your previous offenses, and the failure to address them, leave me no choice. I am imposing a fine of $5,000 for this violation. The words felt like a punch to Angela's stomach. She had no way to pay that kind of money. She had been struggling just to make rent, much less cover the cost of a fine that would take her years to pay off. She could already feel the crushing weight of her financial future slipping further out of reach, and she was terrified that this would set her back in ways she couldn't recover from. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat. All she could do was nod, as if that would somehow make it less real. She felt the sting of her own helplessness, and the shame of not being able to change her circumstances. No matter how hard she tried, the courtroom felt like it was spinning around her, and she wanted to escape, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. She stood there frozen as the judge continued with the formalities, unable to focus on the words he was saying. All she could think about was Marcus, her son, who had been so hopeful for her, and how this fine would only make life harder for him, how she had let him down by not being able to stay on top of the little things, how she had failed to give him the stability she had promised. Angela stood motionless as the judge's voice continued to reverberate in her ears. The words of the fine felt like they were being spoken to someone else, not her, not the woman standing in front of him with her heart racing and her eyes welling with tears. She could barely comprehend the enormity of what was happening. The room seemed to shrink, and the walls closed in around her, but she couldn't move, she couldn't escape, she couldn't even think straight. She had always been able to find a way to keep her head above water, but now it felt like the tide was pulling her under, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The prosecutor's voice seemed to fade as Angela's mind began to race. How would she pay that amount? How could she possibly come up with $5,000 when she could barely make enough to buy groceries each week? How would she explain this to Marcus? How would she even look him in the eye after everything she had promised him? Her heart twisted with guilt and shame. But her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the judge speak again, his tone final as he announced that she would be required to pay the fine in full within 30 days, and failure to do so would result in further penalties. Angela's mind swirled with panic. She felt the world spinning around her, and the weight of the decision felt like it might crush her. She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened, as if there was no room left for air. She forced herself to look up and meet the judge's eyes, but there was no recognition there, no hint of compassion, only the cold efficiency of a man who had made his judgment and moved on. Angela's eyes welled with tears as she tried to maintain her composure, but the pressure was too much. She had never felt so small, so insignificant in all her life. She wanted to shout, to scream, to plead for some kind of understanding. But she knew it wouldn't make a difference in this place where the law was all that mattered, where she was nothing but a name on a piece of paper with a history of mistakes. She didn't even know how to express what she was feeling, not to the judge, not to the prosecutor, not to anyone. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Her eyes flickered to the door of the courtroom, and she thought of walking out, running away from all of it. But where would she go? How could she escape a system that seemed so set in its ways, so unwilling to bend, no matter the circumstance? The law had no place for mercy, no space for compassion. It was all about punishment and compliance, and Angela had no choice but to accept that reality. As she stood there lost in her thoughts, she heard a voice call out from the back of the room, a young man's voice with an unmistakable familiarity. Angela froze for a moment, her heart skipped a beat, and she turned around slowly as if something had shifted in the air. The sound of footsteps grew louder as someone approached the judge's bench. The young man's face was now clearer, and Angela's breath caught in her throat as recognition hit her hard. Marcus. She thought for a brief moment she was seeing things, but the man before her was unmistakable, tall and confident, with a warm smile on his face, a familiar face she hadn't seen in years. Marcus Turner, a former classmate of the judge's, walking toward them like a wave from the past. Marcus Turner stepped forward, his presence filling the room with a strange mix of familiarity and confusion. Angela's eyes widened as she looked at him. For a moment, the weight of the past rushing over her, her heart thumped in her chest, not knowing whether to smile or to cry. This was her son's friend, the boy she had once watched play in their yard, and now here he was walking toward the bench, as if he had all the right to be here. Angela's mind raced and her thoughts scattered at the sight of him. She had not expected to see him today, certainly not in this context, not in this place, with the burden of a fine looming over her head. Marcus walked up confidently to the judge, shaking his hand with a smile that was still as warm as it had been back in high school. Judge Whittaker looked up and greeted him with a surprised but friendly nod, recognizing him immediately as a former classmate. But Angela barely registered the exchange. Instead, she felt her world shifting as memories from the past collided with the present. Marcus's voice brought her back from her haze. "Angela, is that you?" he asked gently, his eyes falling on her, and for a moment everything around them seemed to disappear. He looked so much older now, but there was something in his eyes, something kind and familiar, that made her feel as though she had just stepped back in time, a lifetime ago. She had seen Marcus as a boy, and now here he was standing as a man, but the situation was so different, so much had changed. Angela felt a pang in her chest. She couldn't help but feel proud of Marcus, and at the same time a deep sadness for him. She had wanted to shield him from the hardships of life, wanted to keep him from the burdens she herself had carried, and now she realized that no matter how much she tried to protect him, the world had a way of pulling people into its grasp. Her breath caught as Marcus looked at her, concern written across his face. Marcus was always kind and thoughtful, always aware of what others were feeling, and now he was standing here unsure of how to approach her. His gaze shifted between Angela and the judge for a moment, as if trying to make sense of what was happening. Judge Whittaker continued to smile, but the recognition in his eyes slowly faded. As he turned his attention back to Marcus, he glanced at Angela briefly and then looked at Marcus again, a look of confusion crossing his face. "Marcus Turner, it's good to see you. It's been years, hasn't it?" But his tone was no longer the warm, friendly one it had been when they had greeted each other at the beginning of the day. There was something about the way he spoke now that Angela couldn't quite place. It was as though the weight of the room had shifted, as though Marcus's presence was suddenly making him rethink something. Angela wasn't sure what was happening, but her heart beat faster as she tried to make sense of the connection forming in front of her. As Marcus spoke about his life and caught up with the judge, she could only listen, her heart heavy with the realization of the situation unfolding before her. She could hear Marcus talking about his mother, about how things had been difficult for her, and that brief mention of his mother made something in Judge Whittaker's face change ever so slightly. The warmth that had been there before faded as a recognition flickered in his eyes, a sudden realization hitting him like a hammer. And for a brief moment, Angela saw his gaze flicker toward her, and then back at Marcus. She saw the change in his expression, the flicker of something deeper, something more significant, but before she could understand what had happened, the words were already tumbling out of his mouth. As Marcus continued to speak to Judge Whittaker, Angela stood still, her mind spinning with confusion and disbelief. She couldn't quite process what was unfolding before her. She had known Marcus Turner for years. He had been her son's childhood friend. She had seen him grow up, just like Marcus had seen her own son grow, but the connection between Marcus and the judge was something she had never anticipated. The way Marcus spoke about her made Angela feel uneasy, as if there was something more to their relationship than she had ever known. She watched as the judge's face slowly shifted from one of casual friendliness to something else entirely. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A flicker of recognition passed between the two men, as if a memory from the past had suddenly resurfaced. Angela's heart raced as she tried to understand what was happening. Judge Whittaker's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Marcus, and then back at Angela. Something in his expression changed. The warmth that had been there moments ago began to fade, replaced by a look of realization, a look that hit her like a wave crashing against a cliff. Angela's stomach twisted as she watched him shift in his seat, his hand hovering over the papers in front of him, his eyes flicking back and forth between Marcus and her with an intensity she had not expected. She could feel the tension rising in the room like a storm cloud about to burst, but no one spoke for a moment, and Angela could barely breathe. Her entire body felt numb as she waited for the judge to say something, anything to explain the strange shift that had just occurred. Finally, Judge Whittaker cleared his throat, and his voice came out quieter than before. Marcus, he said slowly, his eyes not leaving the young man's face. It's been a long time, hasn't it? Marcus nodded, but his smile faltered slightly as he looked between the judge and Angela, his expression unreadable. But Angela could see the confusion in his eyes. He was just as uncertain as she was, and Angela's mind raced trying to piece together what had just happened. She had always known Marcus had a connection with the judge, but this was something entirely different. It wasn't just a casual friendship, it was something deeper, something more significant, something that had only just now come to light. Marcus glanced at Angela and then back at the judge, his brow furrowed as if trying to figure out where the conversation was headed. Angela watched him closely, her pulse quickening as she felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. The judge was still staring at Marcus, but his next words caught Angela completely off guard. "You said your mother's name was Angela Harper, didn't you?" Marcus asked the judge, his tone now tinged with something that Angela couldn't quite place. Marcus nodded again, but his face was full of confusion as he glanced at her. Angela's stomach dropped and her mind raced. The realization was dawning on her like a slow-moving train. She felt her heart skip a beat as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. All at once it hit her like a lightning strike. Judge Whittaker had just realized that Angela Harper, the woman standing before him, the woman he had just sentenced to a heavy fine, was none other than the mother of his old high school classmate, the very same Marcus Turner who had grown up playing in her yard, had sat at their dinner table, had been a part of her life for so long without her ever realizing the full connection until now. The world suddenly felt too small, too tight, too suffocating. As the weight of the situation settled over her, she could barely breathe. She stood there, unable to speak, unable to process the sudden shift in reality that had just taken place. The room felt as if the air had been sucked out of it. Angela's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the revelation she had just heard. Her mouth went dry, and her mind swirled in a whirlwind of thoughts. It wasn't possible. Could it really be true that the judge in front of her, the man who had just sentenced her to a heavy fine, was the same person who had known her son Marcus from his childhood, the same man who had grown up with him, played basketball in their yard, and shared moments of their teenage years together? Angela felt as though her world had been turned upside down. She glanced at Marcus, his face full of confusion and disbelief as he tried to process what was happening. The judge's eyes were now locked onto her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The realization seemed to hit them both at the same time, and Angela had no idea what would happen next. Judge Whittaker shifted in his seat and rubbed his temple as if trying to sort through the jumble of memories and new information. It had to be a lot for him too, the idea that the woman standing before him was Marcus's mother, of all people, his old friend's mother, who had struggled and fought for years to raise her son, had somehow ended up in front of him in his courtroom, facing a fine that could ruin her. Angela couldn't even bring herself to look directly at the judge anymore. She kept her gaze on the floor, unable to meet his eyes. The weight of the moment was too much for her to bear. The courtroom that had once felt cold and indifferent now felt suffocating, as if all the walls were closing in around her. Marcus took a step forward, his hand hovering as if unsure of what to do next. He looked between his old friend's mother and the judge, and then back again. His confusion was written all over his face. He had known Angela for years, and had always thought of her as a kind and caring woman, but this situation, this fine, this punishment, it didn't make sense to him. The memories of his childhood with Marcus were filled with laughter and warmth, and the thought that Angela was now facing the brunt of his old classmate's authority left him feeling uncomfortable and uncertain. Angela Harper was not just another defendant in his courtroom. She was someone he had once known, someone who had cared for him and his friends, but now here she was standing before him, facing consequences for something that didn't seem to match the woman he remembered. Judge Whittaker cleared his throat as he finally broke the silence. He looked at Angela, his expression now unreadable. After a long pause, he spoke quietly, but firmly. "Angel Harper," he said slowly, "I didn't realize who you were when your case was called. And now I am faced with a situation where I must reconsider my decision." His voice trailed off for a moment as he glanced at Marcus, who was standing silently beside him, then back at Angela. His gaze softened just slightly. Angela had no idea where this conversation was going or what he was planning to do next, but she could feel the tension in the air tightening with every passing second. The very foundation of her case had shifted beneath her feet, and she was left trying to find her footing amidst the confusion and the unexpected turn of events. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low but filled with a sense of urgency. "Judge Whittaker, I know my mom, I know her well. And I know this isn't who she is. I can vouch for her character and everything she's been through over the years. Please reconsider the fine and give her a chance." Angela felt a tightness in her chest at Marcus's words. His defense of her felt like a lifeline in the storm of uncertainty. She had never asked for this kind of help, but hearing him stand up for her in front of the judge made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The judge sat in silence for a moment, his gaze flickering between Marcus and Angela. The words Marcus had spoken hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone who was drowning. Angela felt the warmth of his support, but also the weight of his plea. It was a strange feeling having her son's childhood friend stand up for her in front of the very man who had the power to decide her fate. Her chest tightened as she realized that despite everything she had done for Marcus, despite all her sacrifices, she was now standing in front of someone from her past, someone who held the key to her future, and she wasn't sure what would happen next. Judge Whittaker's fingers tapped slowly on the edge of his desk, his expression unreadable as he processed Marcus's words. Angela held her breath, waiting for him to respond. She could feel the tension building in the room as the moments stretched on, and she was left in a state of suspended anxiety. Her eyes flickered nervously between Marcus and the judge, trying to read their faces, trying to figure out what was going to happen next, but the silence seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Finally, the judge cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness in the room. "Angela, I don't take my position lightly," he began, "but there are consequences for the actions we take, and I must be fair and impartial when it comes to applying the law." His words were cold, but they carried a weight that Angela couldn't ignore. She felt her shoulders tense as the judge continued to speak, but then he paused for a moment as if reconsidering something. The sharpness in his eyes softened ever so slightly, and he looked over at Marcus again before returning his gaze to Angela. "I understand that this is not just another case to you," Marcus said quietly, standing beside Angela. "I know that my mom has struggled and worked hard to get by, and I know she didn't mean to make this mistake. Please, she's not the kind of person who deserves to be punished like this." Angela could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine care he had for her, and it brought a lump to her throat. She had never expected to find herself here with Marcus in the middle of this courtroom, with the weight of her past mistakes hanging over her, but hearing him speak on her behalf made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. The judge let out a deep sigh and looked at Angela with a level of scrutiny that was both unnerving and unexpectedly kind. For the first time since the beginning of the proceedings, he didn't look at her like a defendant or a statistic. He looked at her like a person, and something in his expression softened. Angela could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the conflict between the law and the human story unfolding before him. She had always known that people could be more than the mistakes they made, but now it seemed as though Judge Whittaker was starting to see that as well. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke again with a measured tone. "Marcus, I appreciate your words and your honesty," he said, "but this is not an easy decision for me. I must weigh everything carefully when it comes to upholding the law, but I will also take into consideration your mother's character and her past." He glanced at Angela briefly before continuing, "I am willing to reduce the fine by half, but I will require you to attend community service as part of the resolution to this case. It will not erase the mistake, but it will give you a chance to make amends in a way that benefits others." Angela could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her heart leaped with a mix of relief and disbelief. She had expected nothing but harsh judgment and punishment, but instead, the judge was offering her a second chance, a lifeline she had never thought she would be given. Angela stood frozen for a moment as the judge's words settled over her. Her mind struggled to comprehend what he had just said. The weight of the sentence, the fine was still there, but it was more manageable now with the reduction and the chance to work off part of it through community service. She couldn't believe it. She had prepared herself for the worst-case scenario, expecting to walk out of the courtroom with a financial burden that would follow her for years to come, but instead, Judge Whittaker had given her a path forward, a way to work through her mistake without being crushed under the weight of it. Angela's heart was racing as she tried to find her words, but all she could manage was a shaky breath. Her chest felt tight with relief and gratitude. Her eyes flickered briefly to Marcus, who was standing by her side, his face filled with a mix of surprise and relief. As well, he had spoken up for her, but even he hadn't expected this outcome. She wanted to say thank you, but the words felt stuck in her throat. She had spent so long carrying the weight of her own mistakes, and now it felt as though someone had finally reached out to help her lift that burden, but still part of her struggled with the shame of being here at all. Part of her wondered if she had earned this second chance, or if it was merely a stroke of luck. The voice of self-doubt crept in, but she pushed it aside, forcing herself to focus on the fact that the judge had seen something in her that made him reconsider his initial judgment, and for that she was grateful. Judge Whittaker continued speaking, explaining the details of the community service requirement and the terms of the reduced fine, but Angela's mind was only half focused on the words. His offer of a second chance had opened a door for her, a door she hadn't even known was there, and she knew she couldn't let this opportunity slip away. She had to take it. She had to do whatever it took to make things right for Marcus, for herself, and for the future they were both working toward. She had never been the kind of person to rely on anyone for help, but today had shown her that sometimes it was okay to accept a helping hand. Sometimes it was okay to lean on others, even if it was just for a moment. The judge finished outlining the conditions of her sentence and looked at Angela with a serious but understanding expression. "Angela, I expect you to fulfill these requirements," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "I'm giving you an opportunity to make things right, and I trust you will take it seriously. If you do everything I've outlined, then we can consider the matter closed. I know this is not easy, but it's a chance for redemption and for growth." He paused for a moment and then added, "Just remember that the law doesn't just punish, it's also about learning and moving forward." Angela nodded slowly, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She couldn't find her voice at first, but when she did, she spoke softly. "Thank you," she said, her words simple but filled with emotion. She knew it wasn't just a thank you for the reduced fine or the community service requirement. It was a thank you for seeing her not as a failure, but as someone capable of change, someone worthy of a second chance. Marcus smiled at her gently, his eyes filled with pride and understanding, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Angela allowed herself to feel a sense of hope. She had faced the storm and had come out on the other side with a chance to rebuild, and it was more than she had ever expected. As she left the courtroom that day, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, the future still uncertain, but no longer as dark and heavy as it had been before. As Angela stepped out of the courtroom, the weight of the day still pressed on her shoulders, but there was a lightness in her chest that hadn't been there before. She had been given a chance, a lifeline she hadn't expected, and while the road ahead was still going to be difficult, it felt more like a path she could walk now, a path that had a chance of leading her to something better. Marcus walked beside her, his presence a steady reassurance as they made their way through the courthouse and into the bustling hallway outside. The noise of the world outside seemed to fade away for a moment, and all Angela could think about was the surreal turn of events that had led them here. She had gone from facing the harshest consequences of her life to being granted a chance to redeem herself, and she couldn't quite process the full magnitude of it yet. Marcus didn't speak immediately, but Angela could sense that he was still processing everything too. His eyes kept flicking to her, as if he was trying to gauge her reaction to the judge's decision. Angela couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt for all the times she had worried about Marcus, not knowing what to do or how to help him through his own struggles, and now here he was standing by her side, supporting her as she navigated this difficult moment. She had always tried to protect and shield him from the harsh realities of life, but today he had been the one to offer his support without hesitation, and it made her heart swell with pride. "You okay, Mom?" Marcus finally asked, breaking the silence, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Angela took a deep breath and nodded slowly, trying to force the lump in her throat down. "I'm okay," she said quietly, her voice shaking just a little bit but stronger than it had been earlier. "I'm just trying to wrap my head around everything. It's been a lot to process." "I'm okay," she repeated, the words as much for herself as for him. Marcus nodded understanding and squeezed her shoulder gently. "I knew you could do it, Mom," he said softly. "I knew you'd find a way even when things seemed impossible." Angela smiled faintly and glanced up at him, her heart full of gratitude and love. "You always say that," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion, "but I didn't believe it myself until now. It's been a long road, Marcus, a road I thought I wouldn't make it down. But now I see that maybe there's a way forward. Maybe things don't have to stay broken. Maybe I can actually start fixing them." Marcus looked at her with a mixture of pride and admiration. "I've always believed in you, Mom. You've worked so hard, and even when things got tough, you never gave up. You always kept fighting, even when it felt like there was no way out." Angela's eyes stung with unshed tears at his words. She had never felt more seen than in that moment. She had always thought that she was alone in her struggle, but hearing Marcus speak to her like this made her realize that maybe she hadn't been as alone as she thought. She reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you for standing by me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not sure I could have gotten through this without you." Marcus smiled and squeezed her hand back. "You don't have to thank me, Mom. I've always got your back, and I always will." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Angela felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. It wasn't just about the fine or the community service. It was about the chance to start over, to rebuild the life she had once dreamed of for herself and her son. It wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, Angela believed it could be done. She was determined to make it work. And with Marcus by her side, she knew she wouldn't have to face the future alone. The days after the court hearing passed in a blur for Angela. She felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted, and she was still trying to find her balance. The reduction of the fine and the community service requirement gave her a breathing room she hadn't expected, but there was still much work to be done. The weight of the past few years had not disappeared overnight. The bills still piled up, her responsibilities still weighed heavy on her shoulders. But for the first time she felt as though she had a sense of direction, a plan to start building a better future for herself and Marcus. Every morning she woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. Her days were now structured around her community service hours, which she had agreed to complete at a local food bank, helping to prepare meals and distribute supplies to families in need. It wasn't glamorous work, but it felt meaningful. It gave her a sense of purpose beyond the struggle of trying to keep everything afloat at home. It allowed her to focus on something bigger than herself, and that gave her a sense of fulfillment that she had been missing for a long time. Marcus continued to be her rock as well. He had always been a good son, but now he seemed even more mature, more focused, as if the challenges of the past had given him a new perspective. He helped her with the little things around the house, fixing things that needed repair, driving her to and from the food bank when she didn't have time to take the bus, and offering words of encouragement whenever she felt herself faltering. His support made all the difference, and Angela found herself growing more and more appreciative of the bond they shared. She knew she had made mistakes over the years, but now she felt a sense of hope that maybe they could make it through this together, stronger than before. One evening after a long day at the food bank, Angela sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in her hands, reflecting on how far they had come. It had been weeks since the court date, and while things weren't perfect, there was a sense of stability that hadn't been there before. Marcus had come home from work earlier than usual and had sat down beside her, offering her a warm smile. "Hey Mom," he said casually, "how's the food bank going?" She smiled back, the warmth in her chest growing. "It's going well, actually. It's tough, but rewarding. I never realized how much I was missing by not giving back before. It's humbling to see the difference we can make in people's lives with something as simple as a meal." Marcus nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "Yeah, it makes a big difference. I think it's good that you're doing it. I know it's not easy, but it seems like it's giving you something to focus on, something positive." Angela took a deep breath and nodded. "You're right. It has been good for me. I feel like I'm finally doing something that matters, and it makes the weight of everything else seem a little more manageable." Marcus smiled softly and gently touched her hand. "You're doing great, Mom. I can see how much effort you're putting into everything and how much you're changing for the better, and I just want you to know I'm proud of you." Angela felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She had always tried to be strong for him, but hearing his praise for the first time in so long filled her with a quiet sense of pride she hadn't realized she was missing. "I'm proud of you too, Marcus," she said quietly. "I couldn't have made it through all this without you, and I just want you to know that I appreciate everything you've done for me and for us." He smiled back at her, his expression warm and genuine. "I'll always be here, Mom, no matter what." As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Angela felt the full weight of the love and support between them. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult. There would still be challenges and hardships to face, but now she had hope, she had strength, she had the belief that she could rebuild her life and make things better for them both. And with Marcus by her side, Angela knew they would face whatever came next together. The months passed and Angela found herself slowly settling into a new rhythm. Her days were still filled with the demands of community service, but there was something different now. She was no longer just going through the motions. She had found a deeper sense of fulfillment in the work she was doing at the food bank. Helping families in need had opened her eyes to the struggles others faced, and it gave her a sense of perspective that she had never fully understood before. It was humbling to see the impact her small actions could have on someone else's life, and it reminded her that despite her own hardships, there was always something to give. Marcus continued to thrive as well. His maturity had grown alongside her own. He had secured a better job in the city and was beginning to take on more responsibility at work. He had started paying for some of their bills, and even helped with the car repairs that had been long overdue. Angela had never seen him so focused, so determined, and it made her heart swell with pride to see the young man he had become. He was no longer just the boy who had once relied on her for everything. He was becoming someone who could stand on his own, and yet he was still there for her, offering support and love whenever she needed it. One afternoon, as Angela finished her shift at the food bank, she sat down on a bench outside to rest for a moment. She felt the cool breeze against her face and looked up at the clear blue sky. A sense of peace settled over her as she took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She had been through so much in the past few years, and while she wasn't where she wanted to be yet, she could see the progress she had made. She had rebuilt her sense of self-worth and had found new purpose in helping others. She had also repaired her relationship with Marcus, and that was something she hadn't thought was possible after everything that had happened. Angela's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a familiar voice calling her name. She turned to see Marcus walking toward her, his smile bright and warm. "Hey Mom," he said, sitting down next to her. "How's everything going?" She smiled back at him, her heart lifting as she saw how much he had grown. "Everything's going well," she said. "I'm tired, but it feels good to be busy in a way that matters. I never realized how much I was missing by not doing something meaningful with my time. I think I'm finally on the right path." Marcus nodded and looked at her with a proud smile. "I've noticed how much you changed, Mom. I'm really proud of everything you accomplished, and I know it hasn't been easy, but you stuck with it, and that says a lot about your strength." Angela felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had spent so long doubting herself, questioning whether she was doing enough, but hearing Marcus speak so kindly of her made her realize that maybe she had been enough all along. Maybe she didn't need to have all the answers or be perfect. She just needed to keep trying and keep moving forward with the love and support of her son. "Thanks, Marcus," she said quietly. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my strength through all of this, and I'll never be able to fully express how much that means to me." He reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to thank me, Mom. You've always been my strength too, and I know no matter what we face, we'll get through it together." As the sun began to set and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Angela looked out at the horizon, feeling hopeful for the first time in a long while. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. She had Marcus by her side, and together they would face whatever came their way, stronger and more determined than ever. As the years passed, Angela found herself standing at the crossroads of a new chapter in her life. The struggles and doubts that had once defined her existence had started to fade into the background, replaced by a quiet confidence she had never known before. Every step forward felt like a triumph. Even the small ones, the challenges that had once seemed insurmountable, now felt like stepping stones leading her to a future she could finally believe in. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days and moments where she wondered if she was doing enough, but there was a lightness in her heart, a sense of peace that hadn't existed before. Angela had spent so many years carrying the weight of her past mistakes that she had forgotten what it felt like to look ahead with hope. Now, though, she could see the horizon stretching out before her, filled with possibility. Her relationship with Marcus had never been stronger. Their bond had deepened in ways she hadn't expected. He had become not just her son, but a partner in the journey they were on together. Their conversations were filled with laughter and shared dreams, and even in the moments of silence, they understood each other more than ever before. They had both grown in ways they hadn't anticipated, and Angela felt a sense of pride in watching him become the man he was today. One evening after dinner, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Marcus turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Mom," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking a lot lately about everything we've been through and everything we've overcome. I don't think I've ever told you this, but I'm proud of you, proud of how far you've come, how hard you fought, even when things looked impossible. I've learned so much from you, watching you never give up, no matter what life threw at you." Angela felt her throat tighten at his words. She had spent so long feeling like she was failing him that hearing him say those words meant more than anything she could ever put into words. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you, Marcus," she said softly. "I don't know where I would be without you. You've always been my reason to keep going, even when I didn't know how to keep going. I don't think I could have gotten through all of this without you." Marcus smiled and squeezed her hand back. "You've always been strong, Mom. You just needed to see it for yourself. I'm just glad I could be here for you when you needed me the most." Angela looked out at the darkening sky, her heart full of gratitude and love for the journey they had shared. The road hadn't been easy, but it had shaped her into someone she could finally be proud of. And the best part was that she knew she wasn't alone anymore. She had Marcus by her side, and together they had built something beautiful out of the pieces of their past. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Angela closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years lift off her shoulders. She had come so far, and she knew the future held more challenges, but also more opportunities for growth and healing. She had learned that no matter how dark the road seemed, there was always a way forward, and with Marcus beside her, she was ready to face whatever came next with hope and strength. They had already overcome so much, and together, they would face whatever the future held with hearts full of courage and love.